Hi, my name is Rafe Poisson and welcome to my channel. I remember sitting in my lounge at the end of September 2020. I was glued to the television screen and I was watching the US presidential debate. And despite not being American, despite not living in America, never visiting America, um, I was still glued to the television. And it felt quite surreal trying to reconcile the fact that um, one of these two men debating with each other on screen would be the leader of one of the most powerful economic and political forces on earth. And at the same time, I'm watching this absolute circus unravel. And these two, they were just creating this chaos, this whirlwind of insults and distraction tactics and non sequiturs. Um, when I when I try and think about a presidential debate, what I imagine is a well-structured sequence of arguments and rebuttals, maintaining some level of decorum, respecting the gravity of the electoral process. But what I watched um, on that day in September 2020, this was very far removed um, from what I had imagined, and I think for many around the world that were equally as interested in this important debate felt similar. Now, I don't highlight the specific event to criticize America or to say anything about American politics. I just use this event as an example because for many people around the world it was the most important debate of the time. And the importance should have been reflected in the rigor of the arguments and the decorum and behavior of the debaters. So why why did the debate unfold as it did? I don't think that the reason has anything to do with the individuals involved. Um, Rather, it seems to me that this is a more of a systemic problem where we as a society have lost the ability to debate, to reason, and in some ways to think. Maybe we never had that ability in the first place, but I certainly think that we're able to develop it. So in this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about arguments, and specifically about logical fallacies, what they are, why we should avoid them, and how they can aid us in better thinking about the arguments of others. Um, Before I get carried away with that topic of arguments and logical fallacies, um, just a brief comment about my last video. So that last video was on perspectives, and a good friend of mine, um, she watched the video and she made some interesting comments. Now she's very knowledgeable about MBTI, which is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is just a fancy way of categorizing people. Anyway, so she made the comment that my video was very it was not very censor friendly, and so she suggested that I added some pictures and um, made it a bit more enjoyable to watch for people that are more senses rather than intuitives. Um, so anyway, that's what I've tried to do in this video. Hopefully, she will approve. But her comments made me think a bit more about um, the topic of the video from the perspective of personality types. And it occurred to me that maybe the assumption that being able to reason about the importance of topics and deal with this flood of conflicting information might only appear important to me because I'm an INFJ, and that I might have a completely different priority if I was something else, another um, one of the other personalities. For example, there are some people that process information a lot more emotionally. So they don't care if an argument is logically sound or flawed, um, or valid or even accurate. What they care about is how do they feel when they listen to that argument. Does the emotion that it evokes make them feel that they can trust the person, trust the information, or not? So anyway, that idea, that tiny revelation, it doesn't change anything for me. But in light of my previous video on perspectives, I thought it was only relevant to just acknowledge that um, my personality type can also play into the inherent biases of my own personal perspective. So I just wanted to make that small point. Okay, now back to the main topic of this video. But first, a little detour. Um, Before defining what logical fallacies are, I'd just like to talk about computer programming. Now, when I was at university as an undergraduate student, um, I studied computer science. It's one of the subjects I was studying was computer science. And for computer science students, one of the mandatory classes was this horrible subject called discrete maths. And this topic dealt with subjects like logic gates, which you see on the left here, these weird pictures. Logic gates, you can kind of think of them as like actual circuitry. So, for example, here the OR logic gate, you've got um, two wires coming in, then it does some kind of circuitry magic, and then there is an output. So, um, OR, the way it works is if this wire here carries a signal, or if this wire here at the bottom carries a signal, or both of them carry a signal, then the output will be a signal. And a signal just means that there is current, so um, it's represented as a 1 or true. So if you've got a 1 and a 0, or a 0 and a 1, or a 1 and a 1, the output will be 1. Um, the only time that the output will be 0, which means no current or false, would be if there was nothing coming in. So these were both 0 or these were both false. Then the result is 0 or false. Um, and and so you've got this idea for each of the different types of logic gates, and there's some summary of the logic gates and the different combinations of inputs and then the corresponding outputs. So this was one of the first things that we studied was logic gates and how to um, express arguments by connecting different logic gates together and then creating what's called the truth table, which looks a bit like um, this table here, where you've got your different permutations of possible inputs, and then following the logic gates through the sequence to see then what the result will be. And we also learned about different types of connectors. So this is then in kind of preparation for this monster on the right. But these are different. And they're represented here. These little red figures. It's a bit small, but maybe you can see. These are little Venn diagrams, and the shaded area is the result of the specific operation. Um, so let's see. So you've got here, for example, in this upper right-hand corner, you've got um, everything within the two overlapping circles in the middle, colored in red. So this is an OR. So there is the mathematical symbol for OR, whereas AND. So here in the bottom right-hand corner, you see an AND. So that looks like a unfinished A. So only the overlapping sections of those circles are colored in because it's only true if the left circle and the right circle are both true, and that's only in the space that overlaps. So it's very important to understand um, these logic connectors, which go in between two, two terms within your statement or your argument. And then this leads to this beast of a topic called propositional calculus, where you then use these ideas of connectors and logic gates to then start building up axioms and proofs and truth statements with fun little laws like um, modus tollens and modus pollens and ponus, sorry, all these weird Latin names, and most of it I've forgotten. But it was very interesting because you look at this and you think, wow, this doesn't look at all like what I imagine computer programming to be. This looks just like weird maths that has nothing to do with anything. It looks a bit overly complicated, confusing, and a bit like gibberish. Um, and yeah, maybe maybe it is. Um, but when you're speaking with humans, you can be very vague, you can be imprecise, you can change direction mid sentence, and the human brain is really quite good at managing all of this ambiguity and uncertainty, but while still maintaining some sense of coherence across the conversation. Unfortunately, computers are quite different. So you have to be very precise with a computer. You have to build up your argument step by step, very, very precisely. So you start by defining all of your terms, and then you have to sequence your premises in order. If they're out of order, you get errors. So if you make reference to something you haven't already defined before that, the computer has no idea what you're talking about. It can't just fill in the gaps like you and I can if we're speaking. It can't imagine what you might mean, and so just error straight away. So you have to be very, very precise in making all of these logical connections. And when you make a statement, you also have to be very clear about what exactly is meant by terms like and, or not. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, I'm sorry, there's something that keeps appearing. Um, so you'll see there's this phrase, I don't like apples or oranges. So this is a very normal English sentence. I don't like apples or oranges. Um, or someone can ask you, do you like apples or oranges? And you can say no. And we have this kind of um, assumption, or I mean, we wouldn't even say it's an assumption. We kind of would just say, of course, we know what that means. Um, but when you think about that statement, I don't like apples or oranges, it can actually have multiple meanings. When you really analyze the semantics, the structure, um, it's ambiguous. So if a computer is now trying to interpret this, um, is it that it's not true that I like apples, or maybe it's not true that I don't like oranges, or is it that it's not true that I like apples or oranges, or is it not true that I don't like apples and oranges? And what it turns out to be is that what we're meaning is that we don't like apples and oranges. So the intersection of apples and oranges, you don't like that, and that's why there's this not brackets apples and oranges. This is what you're actually meaning. Um, and that's what you would have to phrase it as for a computer. But between humans, we can use and or almost interchangeably in some cases, and by the context in which we're making these statements, we kind of figure out what we each mean. But with a computer, you have to be very robotic. You have to be very precise. And so there's these really basic principles when formulating these statements or arguments or instructions for computers. So firstly, you can't make any assumptions about prior knowledge. For example, you can't just tell a computer something like profit is income less expenses without first having to define what are expenses, what are income, what what type of information is income, expenses, and profits. So is it um, is it a sentence? Is it a whole number? Is it um, a number with a decimal? You have to be very precise in defining all of these things up front, and then you can give it some information like profit is calculated by income minus expenses. Then it can understand. Second, you have to connect the terms together with these logical operators. So you can't just say, one, global warming is real, two, this year is hotter on average than last year. You, you can't just make those statements and think, okay, well, this is logic. I've just now proved that global warming is real. You need to connect it. So you have to say, um, first, this year is hotter on average than last year. Therefore, I propose that global warming is real. So you need to not just state sentences or facts or pieces of information. You really have to connect them together. Um, and I think this connection of points or connection of facts or connection of statements to form an argument is something that, in general, humans are particularly bad at. And the point that I'm trying to highlight is that ambiguity and very loose logic is fine for just day-to-day conversations. Um, However, when we want to think about more important issues, express our opinions in a very convincing way, and also when we're trying to evaluate information and arguments from others, it's useful to become a bit more robotic, as though we are trying to give instructions to a computer. Now, you might assume that this kind of robotic logic and rigor and um, attention to the laws of informal logic or formal logic or whatever is used in not just computer science but other things like academics. Um, Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the case. Um, I think if you really want a well-formed logical argument, go speak to a computer programmer. Apart from them, um, it's very difficult to find. Maybe in the philosophy school of philosophy, you might find people that are really good at formulating arguments, but apart from that, it's very hard to find. Now, I really love watching videos by real experts on both sides of a specific debate. And um, I think I used to feel very left leaning in terms of just what attracted me politically. Um, and so then I started watching a lot of right wing commentators, videos, articles, um, and then I try and alternate between, let's say, uh, very left wing and very right wing um, commentators, um, influencers, um, videos, articles, content in general. And I suppose I'm hoping to maybe expose myself to such extremes that somehow the truth will just kind of magically appear before me, or just simply that I understand how to argue from both sides, and maybe that's enough to navigate the terrain. Anyway, so I've been watching a lot of videos recently by Ben Shapiro from the Daily Wire, and and yeah, a very interesting guy. So um, he can be very abrasive, very direct. But if you watch his videos, it's very clear that he's quite sharp. He's quite intelligent, um, and he's very good at formulating arguments. Um, so then the other day, I opened up YouTube and I saw this recommended video for me entitled Neuroscience Professor Destroys Ben Shapiro on Transgenderism. And I love this word destroyed, it's so clickbaity. Anyway, I was intrigued because Ben Shapiro he's a really good speaker and is very good at stringing together very valid, sound arguments. And regardless of whether or not you agree with his opinions and views, you can't deny that he's quite a formidable opponent. Not someone that you want to be put in front of in a debate, especially if it's one that's recorded or televised. Um, Now, many of the videos that I've seen of people debating Ben Shapiro um, have been quite disappointing. So I was hoping that here in this video, this professor of neuroscience would do a really good job. And so here, this is a video um, by a guy called Dr. Chris Thompson, and he's an assistant professor of neuroscience at Virginia Tech. And he has a YouTube channel. So here you can just search for Dr. Chris Thompson, and you should find him. And he has some really great content. And if you're interested at all in medical science and biology or neuroscience, really go check him out. He's got some really interesting videos. Anyway, in this video where he destroys Ben Shapiro, he starts by stating that Shapiro is an excellent source of misconceptions, especially regarding gender identity. And then he proceeds to go through some lecture slides on sex differentiation from some university lecture that he'd given in the past. Now, what disappointed me quite a lot was that he had such great information. And obviously very knowledgeable individual. Um, he was involved in some really interesting research, but he had a seemingly non-existent structure for his argument. Um, he went through a number of scientific facts, but he failed to explain how they would relate to each other or how they refute statements made by Shapiro. So anyway, out of maybe frustration, I guess, I ended up rewatching his video and making notes at the same time. And then what you'll see in the top right-hand corner of the screen, I used a tool called MindMap, um, not map, MindMap, MUP, to visualize the argument. So um, the the green connectors show um, from your proposition the reasons that support it, and if it's thick, it supports it well. If it's thin, it's sort of weakly supported. If there's a red connection, um, this is an argument against the higher premise. Anyway, so I tried to take the notes that I got from him. I tried to rearrange the facts and some comments about misconceptions to try and work out what he was trying to get at, um, try and work out what the argument is that he's trying to make. And and yeah, finally I came up with this map of the argument, and it was actually quite an interesting argument when you look through it. Some of the points don't really make sense. He contradicted. He made a few contradictions, um, and there were also a few other points which he failed to mention. So at the bottom right hand corner, I added in a few counter arguments, um, and you'll see they're surrounded in these little dotted boxes to show that these are um, not explicit in his argument. But I just felt they were so blaringly obvious that I had to insert them. Anyway, I so I put this together. I looked at it and I thought, if only um, he had gone through this kind of exercise before recording this video, he probably would have been a lot more convincing. And if I scrolled through the comments, and it was surprising just how many people made a comment similar to, "You've just proved Ben Shapiro's points," or they quite a large portion of the viewers that commented uh, seemed to think that the information he presented was actually supporting Ben Shapiro rather than refuting him. And I think it's just because of his poor skills around formulating an argument. So he presented amazing information. It's just if he had connected it correctly and structured it correctly, he would have made his point and he wouldn't have confused a whole lot of um, his um, his viewers. Okay, so finally, logical fallacies. What are they? Um, so I don't really like the term logical fallacies. Um, I prefer to think of them as strategies that people employ in debate or arguments, um, as specifically as let's say distraction tactics. So you're arguing about some topic, um, and instead of addressing the content of the topic, you use one of these distraction techniques to bypass that topic and to focus on something unrelated. So maybe you're trying to maybe you end up attacking the person or attacking some other idea or some other version of the idea um, or you change you change the topic completely, but in a way that it feels like it's just a follow on. But all of these distraction techniques ultimately are flawed logic. This is why it's called the logical fallacy, um, and and it's a kind of trap essentially for your opponent. And maybe it's ego, maybe it's not paying attention, but a lot of people fall um, fall prey to these types of traps. So it's good to know about them. Um, so a very simple example of such a trap or logical fallacy or distraction um, uh, tactic. Um, so I've got two young children, and maybe I ask my 3-year-old if she's brushed her teeth, and she'll reply with, "I put away my toys." So obviously I know straight away she didn't brush her teeth, and she's just employing this logical fallacy in a very desperate attempt or hope to think that she will get away with not brushing her teeth by distracting me, by answering a question that I didn't ask, um, and appearing that she has accomplished something, but the reality is it has nothing to do with what I've asked her about the actual content of the discussion. Um, Now, unfortunately, this behavior is not limited to my 3-year-old. It's not only her that employs logical fallacies and distraction techniques. Almost everyone, I think, seems to resort to these tactics at one point or another, um, and doesn't often is not really concerned with is it logically sound. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is what's called a red herring. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard this term red herring. So I'd like to go into a little bit of detail about what it is, how it's used, give an example from the presidential debate, um, and then let's say explain why it's useful to be able to identify this in conversation with others. So during that 2020 presidential debate in the US, um, so there's a lot that can be said about that debate, but in this one particular part where I've sort of highlighted the relevant parts of the transcript, um, you've got President Trump, or the then President Trump. He used a red herring technique in response to the then Vice President Biden's remark on the increasing deficit with China. Okay, so Biden brings up a point about um, the deficit in China, it's been increasing. It's the highest it's ever been. Um, and then the response or rebuttal from Trump is he brings up, he says basically that Biden's son took millions of dollars from Moscow. Now, this is completely a non sequitur. There's no connection between Biden's son taking money from Moscow, from Russia, and the fact that America owes China a whole lot of money under the administration of Trump. So what Trump's trying to do is he doesn't want to address this issue because obviously it's uncomfortable, or he doesn't have a response, or he doesn't know how to react, or maybe he's not even aware of the situation. I don't know. But for whatever reason, he doesn't want to address this, and so he uses this red herring to say, "Oh, look at that! Look over there!" This very clear distraction tactic, and straight away, Biden unfortunately falls for it and starts defending his son, etc. So, um, unfortunately, um, he didn't sort of stand his ground and and reiterate the point, force Trump to come back and deal with this topic about the deficit with China. Rather, he followed the smell of the red herring. So the story about the name of the red herring, um, so it's not actually a fish called a red herring, but it's actually the name of a special preparation of fish where from the Middle Ages where a very strong brine would be used, which resulted in the flesh of the meat of the fish to turn this bright red color. And then um, so because this preparation was so pungent, it really would stink incredibly badly. They would use it with training bloodhounds. So there would be an animal that would be tracked or chased by the bloodhound, and they would then drag this fish preparation across the path of the animal. And because it's so pungent, then the bloodhound would lose the scent of the prey and would then follow this new scent of the red herring. And so it's a very apt description or illustration for this distraction technique. Another another type of fallacy, it's called the ad hominem fallacy, and this is where you're attacking the person, not their argument. And this is the sort of kind of childish response of, yes, well, you're just an idiot. So you're not addressing the content of what they're saying or responding or giving a rebuttal. You're just bypassing the content and attacking the person. Um, so, as an example, I really love watching the monk debates. And there was this really interesting debate from 2018 where the contention was what you call political correctness, I call progress. And in general, it was a very pleasant debate to watch. It was very interesting. Um, and I particularly enjoyed Stephen Fry's participation. However, I was a bit disappointed to see that Michael Dyson, he resorted to ad hominem with Jordan Peterson, at one point just calling him, well, you're just a mean white man. Now, whether or not Jordan Peterson is in fact a mean white man says nothing um, to whether or not he's right. So you can be a mean white man and say something that's that's true or valid, or you cannot be a mean white man and also say something that's true and valid. Um, so by attacking um, by attacking Jordan Peterson in this way, um, it's it's not actually doing anything to further his cause or his reasoning. This is a pure logical fallacy, um, and and it's yeah, like I said, a bit disappointing to see in such a respected debate series. Now, as soon as one one person resorts to ad hominem, it's over. In my mind, at least. I really see it as a desperate last effort attempt. So rather than pointing out a problem with the reasoning or the argument or offering counter arguments, you bypass that content, you attack the person, and there's no reason to do that other than um, you don't want to address the content for some reason. So obviously this is illogical, and as any person, no matter um, who you are, what your personal history is, your personality type, your occupation, your culture, religion, do you have a criminal record or not, anything else, no matter what, any person is capable of expressing a statement, an argument that is valid and sound and true. Um, but a little caveat, a little disclaimer. Um, it's not correct, though, that any time you attack the person, it's an ad hominem fallacy. So there are times when maybe you're having a conversation with someone, you're trying to explain your point of view, you're trying to convince someone, you're trying to have a debate, and and the other person just refuses to acknowledge or address a point that you're trying to express, or the other person clearly doesn't understand what you're trying to say despite simplifying, rephrasing again and again, then I can understand this kind of ad hominem attack. Um, but it's clearly not because you're trying to um, avoid a point, avoid the content. It's out of frustration, and yeah, it may or may not be good, but there are. What I'm just trying to say is there are times when you're watching a debate or you're in a debate yourself, you're having a conversation, an argument, and there is this personal attack, and it's not a logical fallacy. So it's just useful to maybe be aware of that. It's only an ad hominem logical fallacy when it's used as a distraction technique and not out of just pure frustration with the stupidity of the person that you're trying to deal with. Um, Now, a specific type of ad hominem fallacy, it's called a tu quoque. So it's a bit difficult to pronounce because this is a Latin phrase, because all the best things are named in Latin apparently, and it translates to you too. And this basically attacks the hypocrisy of the person. So ad hominem in general is just attacking the person. This is specifically attacking um, the hypocrisy. So this is the practice what you preach type of statement, where you're insinuating that a person's argument is invalid because they behave in a way which is contradictory to what they're saying or arguing. Um, so, for example, I was in a sadly ironic situation where I had to find a new cardiologist because my previous cardiologist had died from lung cancer after, after many years of chain smoking. So um, yeah, so there's um, a very easy target for this kind of ad hominem attack, where you can say, well, how can I trust your advice? You're a cardiologist, and um, and you're a chain smoker. So he would give advice to his patients to stop smoking, but he he was a smoker himself. And I think this type of fallacy is maybe one of the hardest for us to avoid, because I think many of us have this strong, like, visceral reaction to hypocrisy, and it really takes so much effort to disregard the hypocrisy and really attend to the information being presented. So if you're confronted with this doctor that's got a cigarette in his hand smoking, and he's telling you, you really should stop smoking, it's bad for your health, it's very hard to disregard the fact that, well, you're busy smoking while you're telling me that I need to stop smoking. Um, but by saying that, by using that approach, that reasoning, it's logically flawed because it's true smoking is bad for your health, despite the fact that he's a hypocrite. Um, it's still valid. It's still true. Um, now I think so. Obviously, it's foolish if we're just completely objective. It's foolish to disregard information because of the behavior of the person. Um, because it can still be valid whether or not they're a hypocrite. Um, so perhaps we just need to acknowledge that life is complicated, and even when we know something's bad, there are often lots of factors that might compel us to act against our better judgment. Um, so maybe a personal example: I'm overweight, and at a very superficial level, I don't really have a good excuse. I I have diplomas in clinical nutrition, naturopathic medicine, so I really understand exactly what I'm doing to myself every time I binge eat. Um, However, I also suffer at times from really, really bad anxiety, and food becomes a coping strategy for me. And coping strategies are, let's say, functionally dysfunctional in the sense that they're functional, they help you to cope, but they're dysfunctional because they're unhealthy and potentially harmful. Um, but sometimes you just need a way to cope. You just need sometimes you just need to do what you can to get through life. And maybe it was the same for my cardiologist. I don't know. We can't judge. But it doesn't mean that he was wrong when he said don't smoke. Just to clarify, I never smoked. I'm not a smoker. Um, but it was definitely advice that he would regularly give his patients. Um, all right, the next one. Um, this sounds a little bit like a spell from Harry Potter, reductio ad absurdum. Um, so when somebody, when you're talking with someone and they respond to you, and their response starts with, "So you're telling me that?" Well, get ready for the magic of reductio ad absurdum. And this is perhaps a logical fallacy which I find the most annoying. So here the term reductio ad absurdum, again Latin, and it translates to reduced to absurdity. So essentially this is another kind of distraction tactic where the person is not attending to the content of the argument, they're attending to a different form of the argument, um, a weakened form. So they kind of morph your argument into the most ridiculous form of that argument, and then they attack that weakened, ridiculous um, formation of the argument, often through simple ridicule. And I often have the feeling that this this fallacy tends to be employed either when somebody just doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand your argument, and they just can't admit that for whatever reason and ask for clarification, or they just don't have a good rebuttal. Um, and so they seem to think that they can just put words in your mouth, um, laugh at that, make fun of it, and then somehow that means that they've won the argument. Um, Now, what's really great about being able to identify when this reductio ad absurdum fallacy is used is that you're immediately put into a position of power. So you can when you identify this, you have a choice. So either you stop engaging because, well, you've won just by default, either because they they've run out of counter arguments, or they just don't understand and they won't admit it, and so there's nothing you can do. So it's kind of by default you've won the argument. Whether or not they want to or whether or not they're even capable of acknowledging that. Or you can choose to call their bluff, so to say, and focus on that last point that resulted in them using reductio ad absurdum attack, because it means they have nothing of substance to counter it with. So if you stand your ground and you say, that's not what I said, actually I said this, and you insist, um, you know that this was a tactic used out of desperation. Um, and so and especially if you try and reiterate, force the point, and they then come back with either ad hominem, so attacking you, or a red herring, then you know definitely 100% you've won the argument, because this person is scrambling, they don't know what to do, um, and you can easily dismantle their arguments, because it's clear they've got nothing. Now, as an example of this reductio ad absurdum, a few days ago I was having this conversation with a conspiracy theorist, and he was proposing that there is this evil cabal of global elites who are ensuring that some master plan, or script, as he called it, um, was running according to plans that were laid out decades or centuries ago. Now, um, I I tried to approach the argument by implying that human society is super complicated. So it's like a dynamic system in the context of chaos theory. So a so chaos theory says that these complex or dynamic systems um, have this property where a small change has a very big consequence. So often they formulate it as um, they're sensitive to initial conditions that can produce um, uh, significant changes in the long term. So, there's this idea of a butterfly flaps its wings, and on the other side of the world, there's this hurricane. Um, so that's just a kind of mental image to explain the complexity of these dynamic systems. So you make a slight change here, and then there's this big consequence, and it's often almost impossible to predict because of the complexity. So it's almost it almost appears random, but it's definitely not random. It's just the level of complexity is um, beyond our ability to reason about it, and thus to predict it. So I was just basically saying, um, because of this complexity and of the human society, which is um, was so I was trying to frame it in the sense of chaos theory and dynamic systems. Um, I feel like it's very unlikely that there's able to be this kind of script or plan that is able to be effective in the long run. If you look at weather systems, for example, we have years of decades of historical data. We have real-time measurements and sensors, and yet we still find it impossible to accurately predict the weather for tomorrow. So, so just, and that's just the weather, that we have an inordinate number of sensors around the world, um, giving us data in real time. We've got satellites, we've got all sorts of different types of sources of information with historical data, all kinds of complex models, lots of scientists around the world working on these forecast models. We still can't predict the weather tomorrow. So, so human society, especially globally, I would say is equally, if not more, complex than the weather, and probably more prone to these black swan events than the weather. So, um, so how can then there be this? How can there be anyone that can ensure that there was some plan 100, 200 years ago that still um, is being followed today, due to the unpredictability of these dynamic systems? Anyway, so his response was quite funny. I'm sorry. Please excuse me. I've got a bit of a cold. So his response was quite funny. He says, "So you're saying that? Okay, get ready for the magic. The French Revolution was caused by a butterfly sneeze." So immediately I realized, okay, reductio ad absurdum. He either doesn't understand my point and couldn't acknowledge it, or he just had no rebuttal. Um, Now, rather than digging in my heels and forcing him to admit this, which I could, I decided, okay, I'm going to accept the victory, even if I was the only one that recognized it, and just move on. So, I mean, this was a silly example, but um, I think this happens very frequently. And I think more and more so in politics, unfortunately. Anyway, so reductio ad absurdum is also part of a broader group of fallacies called strawman fallacies, which basically just means that um, someone is attacking a weakened form of the argument, the strawman version of the argument, rather than the actual argument itself. So reductio ad absurdum is not only weakened, but it's like twisted to be the most absurd version of that argument. Now, I think if you're the type of person that's interested in truth, you're really interested in understanding um, uh, objectivity, reality, truth. Um, Using strawman just doesn't make sense. What you should be doing is what's called as strongman or steelman, which is you make the argument as strong as possible, and then you try and attack it. You try and analyze it like that, and then you can really get to the truth, or at least some meaningful insights. Um, just just straw manning or using reductio ad absurdum with anything that you don't agree with will never expose truth, will never um, provide insights, and so you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. Um, and actually, I think um, this kind of attack, this kind of strategy, um, I think it reflects badly on you if you use it. Yeah, so when possible, strongman, steelman, like I did with that example from Dr. Thompson. So there are many more logical fallacies out there that we can fall prey to, and I've just introduced a small number of these today. But I hope that I've made the point, or been able to demonstrate the utility in investigating this topic more fully. And I think there's three basic reasons to really get into this subject matter. So I think the first one is to improve the way in which you're able to think and reason through information. The second is to be able to get your point across more clearly, more accurately, without falling into the temptation of using these flawed strategies. And then the third one is to prevent falling prey to these strategies when others are using them, like we saw Biden fall victim to the strategy from Trump. Um, I'd like to end with this quote, which maybe tempers the tone of my discussion today, because um, we are not purely analytical, logical beings. We're also emotional beings, and so this is a nice quote. It comes from um, the Bengali polymath. I will attempt his name, Rabindranath Tagore, and what he says is, "A mind or logic is like a knife or blade. It makes the hand bleed that uses it." So thank you for listening. Thank you for making it all the way to the end of the video, and hope to see you in another video soon.